The first thing the Tau took from me was not my loyalty, it was my certainty. For 10 years under the Imperium, fear had tasted like metal and smoke at the back of my throat. It was there when I woke, there when I worked, there when I tried to sleep. Then the Tau ships appeared above our world, and that old taste of fear mixed with something I had never allowed myself to name: possibility. I did not dare say the word out loud. On a world like ours, hope had always been another form of heresy. My name is Adrian Vale, and by the standards of the Imperium I am a traitor. That is what the commissars would have called me if commissars still ruled this world. But they do not. The execution stages are gone. The shock batons are gone. The sermons about glorious suffering are gone. What replaced them is not freedom, not truly. It is another system, another doctrine, another hierarchy draped in softer language. And if you want to understand what it means to be human under Tau rule, you have to understand what life was before they came. Our world was called Meridian Prime. It was nothing special by imperial measure, just another hive planet on the eastern fringe, another industrial furnace feeding the endless appetite of empire. 8 billion souls were packed into towers of ferrocrete and steel that rose for kilometers above a poisoned surface. No one sane would walk without sealed gear. I was born in the mid-hive, in a sector where the air was barely clean enough to breathe without a respirator, and still filthy enough to rot your lungs by 30. My father worked in munitions, 12 hours a shift, 7 days a week, 40 years of uninterrupted service until his lungs gave out from metal dust and chemical vapor. I remember how he came home each cycle, face gray with exhaustion, hands trembling from motions repeated thousands of times a day. He moved like a machine after the factory had finished using him, every gesture stiff from repetition, every breath carrying the dry rattle of a chest being slowly ground away from the inside. He would sit in the dark before eating, not because he enjoyed silence, but because speaking cost effort, and effort was something the line had already taken from him. He never complained. Complaints were a kind of blasphemy, an admission that service to the emperor was something less than the greatest honor a mortal could receive. In our district, people measured worth by endurance, how many shifts you could survive without collapsing, how many toxins your body could absorb before you started coughing blood, how long you could go without medicine and still report for duty on time. There were no stories about joy, only stories about service. Men who lost fingers and came back the next day. Women who gave birth in the morning and returned to textile work by the next cycle. Old laborers with spines bent into permanent curves from decades over assembly benches, still praised by the priests as examples of imperial virtue. My father believed those stories because he needed to. I know that now. Belief was the only thing that made his life sound like anything other than a sentence carried out one breath at a time. My mother worked in a textile line making uniforms for the Astra Militarum. She died when I was 14, crushed by a faulty press that no one bothered to repair because the maintenance schedule had been sacrificed to quota demands. Her body was rendered into corpse starch. Even in death she served the Imperium. When my father finally broke, I inherited his place on the line. I was 16. My training lasted 3 days. By the end of the first week, my hands were blistered and burned from handling hot metal. By the end of the first month, I stopped feeling my fingers after the 8th hour. By the end of the first year, I understood that this was my entire life. Station 2847, on Beta 7 line, manufacturing bolter rounds until my body failed exactly the way my father's had. And by the standards of Meridian Prime, that life counted as privilege. The lower hive was worse. I had been born there before my father earned a transfer after 20 years of perfect service. Down there people lived in near darkness, lit by failing lumens and the orange glow of industrial furnaces. The air was so toxic respirators were mandatory, and even then few people reached 40. Gangs ruled whole sectors and extorted workers who were already surviving on ration allotments that would have shamed a prison colony. When I was very young, I thought the lower hive was what the whole universe looked like. Leaking pipes overhead, condensation thick with chemical residue, walls layered with soot, mold, and devotional posters so old that the emperor's face had flaked away from half of them. Children learned to step over bodies before they learned to read. Sometimes those bodies were dead. Sometimes they were just sleeping where exhaustion had finally beaten them. Either way, no one stopped, because stopping for long in the lower hive only made you another obstacle to be stepped around. My father called the transfer to the mid-hive a miracle earned through labor. Now I think it was just a slightly cleaner layer of the same grave. But when you have come from the bottom, any change in air feels like grace. And still, even there, people clung to faith. The Imperial cult was the one constant. We prayed before shifts and after shifts. We prayed over our food. If the gray protein paste we were given deserved the word food. It was processed from recycled organic matter no one asked too many questions about. The priests of the ecclesiarchy told us our suffering was necessary, that every shell we produced, every hour we endured, every breath of poisoned air we drew was an act of worship, proof that our short and miserable lives mattered in the great cosmic struggle against the enemies of mankind. I can still hear the rhythm of those sermons. Suffering is purification. Obedience is love. Exhaustion is devotion made visible in the flesh. They were very good at taking every indignity we experienced and recasting it as spiritual privilege. If the food was foul, then we were learning discipline. If the air was poison, then we were proving faith. If a child died in a manufactorum accident, then the emperor had chosen that child for sacrifice in a war too vast for ordinary minds to comprehend. When you hear that from birth, it settles into bone. Even when part of you recoils, another part clings to it because meaning is easier to bear than randomness. It is easier to think your mother died for something sacred than to accept she died because a machine was cheaper to replace than a worker. I wanted to believe it, thrown how I tried. But faith becomes difficult when you watch your mother die beneath a machine that could have been repaired and was not, because one laborer was worth less than an hour of downtime. Faith becomes difficult when you watch your father spend 3 years slowly drowning in his own failing lungs, because medical treatment is reserved for citizens deemed more valuable than worn-out factory hands. Prayer starts to feel hollow after that. Still, you do not say such things. You do not even fully admit them to yourself. Thoughts are seeds. If you let them grow, the commissars call the harvest heresy. And heresy only ever ended one way: a public execution. Your name erased from records. Your existence scraped clean as if you had never lived at all. So I lived quietly. 22 years measured in quotas, catechisms, shift rotations, and the few thin scraps of rest between them. I had never seen stars. The sky above the hive was a blanket of smog and exhaust. I had never tasted real food. I had never known love, not the kind poets write about, only the exhausted affection of people too tired to offer each other much more than basic human tenderness. And then the Tao came. I was on shift when the sirens began. Not the routine alarm we knew, not a jammed feeder or quota deviation. This was the planetary defense alarm, a deep mechanical howl I had only heard twice before in my life. It rolled through the hive walls and made the metal grating under our boots vibrate. Every line stopped at once. Tools froze in our hands. Our eyes lifted as if we could somehow see through kilometers of metal and stone to the war in the sky. The overseer, a thick-bodied man with augmetics replacing 3/4 of him after some old industrial accident, barked through his amplifier for us to return to work. Quotas do not pause for alarms. No one moved. Then the Vox speakers cracked alive. The planetary governor spoke, or a voice I knew had to be his, though I had never seen him. Citizens of Meridian Prime, this is not a drill. Xeno's forces have entered the system. The planetary defense force is mobilized. All workers are to double production efforts. The Emperor protects. Xenos. That one word carried a terror planted in us from childhood. We were taught that all aliens were corrupt, unnatural, fit only for extermination. To touch them was contamination. To listen to them was spiritual poison. But which kind? Orcs, Eldar, Tyranids. Every story we had ever heard ended in blood. We went back to work because there was no choice. My hands moved automatically, feeding casings and loading powder, but my mind was elsewhere. If the Xenos broke through, what happened to people like me? Unarmed workers with no training beyond production drills. The answer was obvious. We would be handed scrap weapons, told to die for the world that had given us nothing but suffering, and expected to call it honor. That battle above our world lasted 3 days. We only knew it by the distant thunder of impacts and the occasional shudder that passed through the hive structure. The production lines never stopped. We worked 18-hour shifts. We slept on the floor beside our stations. We ate cold rations over conveyor belts while overseers walked among us with shock mauls to make sure no one slowed. Time became meaningless during those 3 days. There was only the line, the clatter of casings, the heat of presses, the ache in the legs, and the constant pressure of fear. Men nodded off standing and were dragged awake by electric blows. Women with hands shaking from exhaustion kept feeding components into machines because losing a finger was still considered better than being accused of delay. Every rumor that passed down the hall grew darker than the last. Orbital guns silenced. Enemy landings in the upper hive. Governor's bunker breached. The planetary defense forces collapsing. No one knew what was true. All of it sounded plausible. What I remember most is not the fear of invasion, but the certainty that even during invasion the system expected us to die productively. If the Xenos reached the hive, we would not be evacuated. We would be ordered to keep manufacturing until the walls broke and then handed scrap rifles to die in place. The empire that claimed to love us had no use for us beyond the output of our hands. On the second day, the commissars arrived. They built a temporary execution platform in the center of the hall. 10 workers were chosen at random and shot with bolt pistols. Their bodies were left where everyone could see them. To remind you of the cost of failure, the senior commissar announced, "Every second lost on this line is another weapon not delivered to the defenders of the Imperium. Every hesitation is betrayal." I had not known any of the 10. It did not matter. The message was clear. On the third day, everything changed. The explosions stopped. The sirens went silent. For 6 hours, there was only the hum of factory machinery and the kind of waiting that feels worse than fear. Then the Vox system spoke again, but this time the voice was wrong. It spoke low Gothic with precise, almost mechanical clarity, and beneath that precision was an accent that was unmistakably not human. "Citizens of Meridian Prime," it said, "your world is now under the protection of the Tau Empire. Resistance has ended. Your previous leaders were unable to ensure your well-being. Under the guidance of the greater good, you will find a better life. Cease current operations and await further instruction. Resistance is not only futile, it is unnecessary. We have not come as conquerors, but as liberators." The message repeated every 15 minutes. In the gaps we heard fighting somewhere deeper inside the hive. Gunfire, muffled blasts, screams echoing through ventilation shafts. Our overseer tried to force us back to work, but his authority had evaporated. For the first time in my life, workers whispered openly without permission. Liberators, a better life. Those were not concepts our world had taught us to understand. "It is a lie," the overseer shouted. "Xenos lie. They will corrupt you. They will turn you into filth. The Emperor demands your continued service." But his words rang empty, because we all knew what service had brought us. We had seen the corpses on the execution stage. We had watched our families break under a system that valued quotas more than human life. When the first Tau entered the hall, the overseer raised his shock maul to resist. A single pulse round hit him in the chest, burned through augmetic plating and flesh, and dropped him where he stood. Smoke rose from the wound. None of us moved. The fire warriors, as I later learned to call them, advanced with a fluid grace that made Imperial soldiers look clumsy by comparison. Their pulse rifles were up, but not aimed at us. Behind them came one unarmed Tau in ceremonial robes marked with symbols I did not know. "Do not fear," the unarmed Tau said through a translation device attached to his armor. His voice was unexpectedly gentle. "You are no longer slaves. Under the greater good you will find purpose not in suffering, but in contribution. Not in fear, but in understanding. We have not come to destroy your lives. We have come to free you from a tyranny that offered you only pain." He paused and let his large dark eyes move over our faces. "I understand that you were taught to fear us. I understand that you were told we are monsters, corruptors, enemies of humanity. Look around you. Look at the conditions in which you were forced to live. Ask yourselves who the real enemy was, those who came offering a better path, or those who kept you in chains and called it virtue." No one answered. We were too shocked, too tired, too afraid. "You are free to go," he said at last. "Return to your habs, rest. Tomorrow we begin the process of integration. Those who wish to help build a better future will be given opportunities. Those who do not will be given alternatives. But understand this. There will be no violent return to your previous existence. Your old world is dead. A new one is being born." Then he left. The fire warriors went with him, and we were alone again among the machines, surrounded by the dead monument of the life we had known. I do not remember the walk back to my hab that night. My body moved by habit while my mind clawed uselessly at what had happened. When I finally reached my room, a 2 by 3 meter box I had always called home because I had no better word, I collapsed on the bunk and cried for the first time in my adult life. I did not know whether I was crying from relief or grief. All I knew was that the one constant in my existence, the structure that had held my life together even when that structure was a prison, had vanished. The process the Tau called integration began the next morning, not with klaxons or prayer bells, but with a soft, almost pleasant tone drifting through the hive vox. "Citizens of Meridian Prime," the same voice announced, "today marks a new era for your world. All citizens are to report to designated processing centers for assessment and placement. This is not optional. Understand that this is not intended to suppress you, but to understand your skills, your needs, and your potential contribution to the greater good." Processing centers were established in former administrative buildings across the hive. I joined the river of workers heading toward the nearest one, every face carrying the same tight uncertainty. Execution, re-education, forced service, something worse. We did not know. The line stretched for kilometers, and even standing in that line felt different. There were no guards with shock batons stalking us, no commissars scanning for dissent, only Tau soldiers posted at intervals with weapons lowered, watching more like sentries than executioners. It took me 4 hours to reach the front. Inside, the processing center felt both familiar and utterly alien. Rows of desks, soft lighting instead of harsh industrial lumens, cleaner air than I had ever breathed below the upper hive. Behind each desk sat either a Tau or a human collaborator, or so I assumed. There was no shouted abuse, no barking of serial numbers. People were processed efficiently, but with a calm that made the whole place feel less like a detention center and more like a civic office from some civilization too orderly to be real. Workers stepped forward, answered questions, received tokens and devices, then moved on with the stunned expressions of people who kept waiting for the hidden cruelty to reveal itself and could not find it. That absence of overt violence was unnerving in its own way. Pain I understood. Humiliation I understood. But administrative kindness delivered by conquerors felt like stepping onto solid ground and discovering it was not stone at all, but something softer that might give way beneath you at any moment. My handler was an older human man in blue and white dress uniform marked with Tau symbols. He might have been in his 60s, an age almost mythical on Meridian Prime. Name, he asked in a neutral tone. Adrian Vale, I said. He entered it on a datapad, more elegant than any device I had ever seen in Imperial use. Age: 22 standard years. Previous occupation: bolter ammunition production, Beta 7 line, Station 2847. Education: basic literacy, 3 days of technical training. Family: both parents dead, industrial accidents. Something flickered across his face. Sympathy, maybe. Regret. When he said, "I am sorry for your loss," it sounded genuine, and that alone felt disorienting. He asked about my skills, my health, my interests. Interests stopped me cold. The idea of hobbies, of doing anything for pleasure, was so foreign to my life that I did not know how to answer. "I do not think I have any," I admitted. He nodded as if it were expected. Many citizens from your world were denied the chance to develop personal interests because survival consumed everything. That will change. He handed me a small metal token marked with symbols. Temporary identification. It grants you access to housing, food, and basic services while integration continues. You will receive your work assignment in 3 days through your communication unit. My communication unit turned out to be a slim handheld device with an integrated display. When I touched it, the screen lit in low Gothic. "Welcome, Adrian Vale. Your integration process has begun. Proceed to assigned housing for orientation." My new housing was in the mid-hive in a sector already renovated by the Tau. The difference was staggering. Instead of a cell barely large enough for a bunk and a locker, I was given a real apartment, 20 square meters, a separate sleeping space, sanitation with running water, a small food preparation alcove, and a window, an actual window with transparent material instead of a vent grate. There was more space in that apartment than I had possessed in my entire life. Cleaner air than I thought possible inside a hive, adjustable lighting, furniture designed for comfort rather than bare utility. The sanitation unit alone felt obscene to me, running water that did not stink of metal, enough pressure to actually wash industrial residue from skin, enough privacy to stand still without another body pressed half a meter away. There was storage. There were folded linens. There was a small heating surface for food preparation. None of it was luxurious by the standards of worlds I had only heard about in whispers, but to me it felt almost decadent. I touched everything when I first arrived, half expecting it to vanish or trigger some hidden reprimand. The wall panel for the lights, the smooth edge of the table, the transparent window seal, the communicator charging slot. Years of Imperial life had trained me to think that anything too convenient probably belonged to someone more important, and that touching it without permission would earn punishment. Standing alone in that room, with no one shouting at me to hurry, was so unfamiliar it felt less like relief than vertigo. I sat on the bed, which was far softer than the thin slab mattress I had slept on for years, and stared at the room around me. It should have felt like improvement. Objectively, it was improvement, but part of me recoiled. My parents had died in conditions 10 times worse than these. Millions still lived like that, and here I was, taking charity from alien occupiers I had been raised to think of as lower than animals. Yet another voice in me, a voice I had spent my whole life burying, asked a different question. If the Tau were monsters, why was this the first place anyone had offered me even a fragment of dignity? The first week of integration felt like living inside disorientation itself. Each day brought new routines, new ideas, new assumptions about what life could be. Education sessions were mandatory. Every day from 9 until 12 we sat in large auditoriums and listened to lectures on the greater good. The instructors were a mix of Tau and humans, the latter clearly people from other worlds who had joined the Tau long before our occupation. Their central doctrine was simple: all sapient beings have value. That value is best fulfilled through cooperation for collective welfare. Each Tau caste, fire, earth, water, air, and ethereal, has a role. Harmony between them creates progress beyond selfish ambition. One human instructor, a scarred man with the calm tone of someone who had once believed in the Imperium and no longer did, told us that humanity had been deceived. We had been taught that suffering was noble, that sacrifice for a distant emperor who could not hear our prayers was the highest purpose of life. The greater good, he said, offered another path, one where contribution was recognized and each person mattered for what they could build rather than what they could endure. Part of me wanted to believe him. Another part, shaped by 2 decades of imperial conditioning, waited for the trap. But the days passed and the trap did not spring, at least not in the way I expected. The food they gave us had taste, real taste. Fresh vegetables from hydroponic systems the Tau had installed. Protein that actually resembled meat instead of the gray recycled paste I had lived on. There were textures I had no names for because my childhood had never included them. Crisp greens that snapped between the teeth, warm starches that carried spice, broth that tasted of actual ingredients instead of synthetic salt. I remember one meal in particular, simple by any sane standard, but it nearly undid me. A bowl of seasoned grain, strips of cultured protein, and steamed vegetables with a sauce that carried heat and sweetness at the same time. I sat there staring at it before I took the first bite because part of me truly believed food that good had to belong to someone else. Medical care was provided to everyone. I underwent the first real full physical assessment of my life. A Tau medic and a human assistant cataloged the damage done to my body by hive labor, chronic inflammation in the lungs, stress fractures in the hands, vitamin deficiencies from years of inadequate nutrition. This can be treated, the medic told me through a translator. Recovery will take months, but you will see meaningful improvement. The pain you have accepted as normal is not something you should have to live with. The idea of treatment given not because I was a valuable machine part, but because I was a living being capable of suffering, was almost harder to process than the treatment itself. Maybe the strangest thing of those first weeks was the absence of constant fear. Under the Imperium, every moment carried a background terror. Say the wrong thing, fail to meet quota, look skeptical at the wrong sermon. There were always eyes watching, always a bolt pistol somewhere nearby to correct you. Under the Tau there were supervisors, yes, and coordinators and administrators, but they felt managerial rather than punitive. They did not carry weapons. They did not talk about the glory of punishment. They explained rules as if rules were supposed to make sense. Do this because it supports the collective welfare, not because a distant throne demands it. I kept looking for the hidden cruelty that Imperial propaganda had promised me. I looked for sadism. I looked for malice. Instead, I found a structured and hierarchical society that seemed to genuinely care whether its members were healthy and useful. That frightened me more than open brutality would have. On the 8th day, my communicator lit with a work assignment. Industrial Complex Kelrose 7. Production of components for civilian infrastructure. Report at 700 hours standard. Orientation will be provided. Production, of course. It was all I had ever known. Part of me felt disappointed that my life would still be a line and a machine. Another part felt relief. At least machines were familiar. Kelrose 7 had been built in what used to be one of the lower hive levels, the part of the planet I once associated with the worst squalor on Meridian Prime. The Tau had rebuilt it completely. Structures that had once been damp concrete shells were reinforced with better materials. The ventilation was real ventilation, not vents that merely moved poison from one corridor to another. The air was not perfect, but it was breathable without a mask. I arrived 15 minutes early from old habit. Other workers were gathering outside, all human, all carrying the same nervous expression I knew I wore myself. Our supervisor was a Tau from the Earth caste, stocky and broad-shouldered in practical work armor. Through his translator, he introduced himself as Tauren Squad Coordinator. Our task, he explained, was to build water purification systems, structural supports, and energy distribution components. Under the Imperium, we had manufactured tools of war. Here we would make tools that allowed people to live. He paused, letting that settle. Many of you are accustomed to unsafe conditions, he said. That will change. In Tau philosophy, every worker deserves a safe environment, fair compensation, and recognition for their contribution. You are not expendable. You are not machines. You are thinking beings whose efforts matter to the greater good. The words were beautiful. I did not trust them. Every system has rhetoric. The Imperium spoke endlessly about duty and honor while grinding people into paste. Why should the Tau be any different? Then they showed us the production hall. It was clean. That struck me before anything else. The floor was not slick with oil and blood. The machines were maintained. Every moving part had guards and clear safety markings. The workstations were spaced to allow room to move. The lighting was bright without being harsh, steady instead of flickering. It looked like someone had actually thought about whether the environment helped human beings work. My group of 5 was assigned to pressure casting equipment producing components for pipeline systems. The training lasted 2 full weeks, not the 3-day rush I had received in Imperial service, but a real education that covered not only how to operate the machines, but why they worked the way they did, what could go wrong, and how to prevent it. Our human instructor was a man named Corvin who had lived under Tau rule for 10 years. He taught with a patience that felt almost suspicious. You were taught to follow instructions without asking why, he said during one session. The Tau believe understanding creates better workers. If you understand why precision matters, why process matters, you produce better work and you take ownership of your role. Ownership, another concept I barely knew how to hold. In the Imperium, I had been a replaceable cog. The line would have continued exactly the same if I had died and someone else had taken my place. Here the Tau seemed to offer something different, the idea that my labor was not merely extraction but contribution. The workday itself was structured differently. 8 hours, 2 15-minute breaks, 1 full meal period. The breaks were mandatory, not luxuries that vanished whenever quotas slipped. Supervisors tracked fatigue as a safety concern rather than proof of moral weakness. Injuries were logged, analyzed, and used to alter procedure. Even the idea that an accident should lead to system correction rather than individual blame felt radical to those of us raised by Imperial industry. The dining hall was another revelation. Clean tables, actual chairs, food prepared with some thought given to taste and nutrition. There were wash stations at the entrance so grease and metal dust did not follow us to our meals. There were windows displaying maintenance schedules and production goals with explanations attached, as if workers were meant to understand the larger shape of what they were contributing to rather than simply obeying. None of this made the work easy. Repetition is still repetition. Machines still fail. Muscles still ache. But the whole environment conveyed a message I had never heard before, that efficiency and human well-being were not mutually exclusive concepts. Once you have seen that, it becomes impossible to unsee how much suffering the Imperium treated as unnecessary collateral, and how much of it was actually deliberate indifference. For the first week I sat alone, eating in silence. Old habits cling hard. Part of me kept waiting for someone to punish me, either for speaking too much or not enough. Others were less reserved. Slowly conversations formed. People shared stories about their lives under the Imperium and their first impressions of Tau rule. One of the men, an older worker named Bran with faded gang tattoos on his hands, said he had been born in the lower hive and never expected to live to 30, much less 50. Now, he said, the air no longer hurt his chest every day. The water was actually clean. For the first time in his life, he could breathe without pain. He talked about the old lower hive the way veterans talk about battlefields, with the strange mixture of disgust and intimacy reserved for places that nearly killed them. Whole corridors where gang tolls were collected in blood. Filtration units broken for years. Children with chemical burns on their arms because no one could afford proper gloves. For Bran, every repaired pipe and every functioning vent felt like a miracle bought at the price of pride. That did not make the price easier, only more complicated. "That is how they get you," another worker muttered. "A hard-faced woman named Leora. They make us dependent. They make us forget we are human. My brother served in the Planetary Defense Force. He died fighting them. And now I am here eating their food and working their machines as if that is normal." Her words brought an uneasy silence because all of us had thought some version of the same thing. By Imperial standards, we were collaborators. Our acceptance of Tau rule, even if forced by circumstance, was betrayal against the God Emperor, against humanity, against everything we had been told to revere. Bran answered her quietly. "Your brother died defending a system that would have fed him into a meat grinder without a second thought. I am not saying the Tau are saints, but at least they pretend our lives matter while we are alive." "It is not care," Leora said. "It is farming. They keep us healthy because healthy livestock works harder. The only difference is the pen is cleaner." I said nothing, but her words followed me long after the meal ended. Was she right? Were we simply trading one slavery for another, a more comfortable version? Then I would remember my father's scarred hands, my mother's blood in her lungs, the bodies left on the execution stage, the overseer who once beat a worker nearly to death for falling asleep at his station. If this was a cage, it was at least a cage built for life instead of slow extermination. In the 41st millennium, that may have been the best anyone could hope for. As weeks became months, the education sessions deepened. What had begun as orientation became something closer to ideological reconstruction. Sessions were held 3 times a week. Each lasted 2 hours. Attendance was compulsory. Missing one without a serious medical reason did not lead to punishment in the Imperial sense, but it did tend to result in reassignment to less desirable roles. The implication was clear. The instructors were a blend of water-caste Tau and human true believers. The humans were often more persuasive than the Tau because they understood our emotional language as well as our spoken one. One instructor in particular, a woman named Marith from a world conquered 20 years earlier, spoke with a quiet conviction that was hard to dismiss as simple propaganda. "I know what you are thinking," she told us one day, looking over a room full of skeptical faces. "You were taught that the Imperium is the only thing standing between humanity and extinction, that the God Emperor protects you, that your suffering serves a purpose. I believed that too. I thanked him every day for the chance to serve, even when that service meant watching my children go hungry because food had been redirected to military quotas." She let the room sit with that. Then the Tau came and I expected horror, slavery, mutation, desecration. Instead, I was given what the Imperium never once offered me, a choice. Someone in the audience, a young man whose defiance was still bright enough to be dangerous, cut in. "What choice? Join them or die?" Marith did not raise her voice. The choice to understand, the choice to look at evidence instead of doctrine. The Tau did not demand that I stop being human. They asked only that I recognize the Imperium had weaponized my humanity against me, turning my need for meaning into a tool of control. She activated a hollow display showing human worlds under Tau administration, people working beside Tau and other client species, schools with actual resources, hospitals treating the sick without first asking how useful they were to the state. "This is not utopia," she said. "The Tau are not perfect. No society is, but they offer something the Imperium never could. The belief that life can be more than suffering, that your value is not measured only by how much pain you can endure before you die. The argument was carefully constructed. The instructors did not deny the emperor's existence. They reframed him. Perhaps, they suggested, he had once intended humanity to flourish. Perhaps the Imperium built in his name had been twisted by fanatics, bureaucrats, and generations of fear. If so, accepting Tau rule could be presented not as rejection of human identity, but as escape from a corrupted institution that had betrayed its founding purpose. It was brilliant because it did not demand an immediate violent break with everything we had been taught. It offered continuity where total rupture would have caused revolt. You could keep the emperor as a distant symbol if you wished, so long as you severed him from the institutions that had shaped your life. You could still call yourself human while agreeing that human rule had failed you. The Tau did not need to tear your old beliefs out by force, if they could gently hollow them from the inside and leave the shell standing. It was clever. It let people keep pieces of themselves while the rest was slowly rearranged. Not everyone accepted it. Some remained fiercely loyal to imperial doctrine, whispering prayers when they thought no one listened. But even they grew isolated. Those who embraced the greater good received better assignments, more responsibility and visible approval. Those who resisted were not publicly punished, but they found themselves drifting toward harder jobs, poorer social standing, and quiet exclusion. It was control, certainly, but it was not imperial control. There were no execution stages, no commissars hunting heresy. Instead, there was a constant, almost invisible shift in what counted as normal, and little by little many of us changed without noticing the moment the change truly happened. I remember the exact moment I realized how much I had changed. It was about 6 months after the Tau arrived. I was at my station when a casting unit jammed. Nothing catastrophic, just a seized component that halted production. Under the Imperium, my first instinct would have been terror, the immediate certainty that delay meant punishment and punishment might mean death. Instead, I shut down the machine according to safety protocol and reported the issue. Torin came over. He inspected the fault. Together we cleared it and talked through how to prevent a repeat. "Good work," he said when we were done. "You identified the problem early enough to prevent a serious failure. Attention like that has value to the greater good." It was a small thing, those words, but they hit me harder than they should have. For the first time in my life, someone in authority recognized not just my labor, but my judgment. Not as a disposable unit, but as a person whose attention mattered. That may sound insignificant to anyone raised in a less brutal world. On Meridian Prime it was revolutionary. Under the Imperium, attention was not rewarded, it was extracted. You were expected to notice problems because if you failed to notice them you would be punished, not because your awareness had any inherent value. Praise barely existed. The line consumed effort and silence. To be told that caution, thought, and precision were worth something beyond avoidance of pain was enough to shake the foundations of how I understood myself. And in that moment, I understood I was beginning to believe. Not fully, not comfortably, but enough. Enough to think maybe society could function through mutual benefit instead of fear. That realization felt both liberating and sickening. I was a traitor. I had let alien conquerors reshape my understanding of the world. Worse, I was no longer sure they were wrong. Over time, one fact became impossible to ignore. For all their language about equality and contribution, humans under the Tau were second-class citizens. The inequality was subtler than the Imperium's brutal stratification, but it was real. Tau society was rigidly organized by caste: fire, earth, water, air, and ethereal. Each caste had a role. Movement between them was impossible. Tau were born into caste and remained there for life. Humans existed outside that system, which meant beneath it. Officially, we were Gla, human helpers, human allies. In practice, we were useful instruments, sometimes respected, occasionally even trusted, but always subordinate to any Tau of any caste. You saw it in small interactions. When a Tau spoke, humans listened. When a human spoke, a Tau might listen if the moment suited them. Resources flowed first to Tau citizens and only then to us. Housing, medicine, education, all of it followed the same logic. It was not malicious. The Tau were not sadists, but there was an assumption woven through everything that Tau were naturally fit to lead and humans naturally fit to support. I saw it in labor assignments. Tau managed machines, supervised systems, and made decisions. Humans handled the more tedious or dangerous physical work. Even when a human had decades of experience, a young Tau fresh from training held more authority. One moment in particular fixed that truth in my mind. Bran, the older worker with the gang tattoos, proposed a modification to our production process that would have increased efficiency significantly. He had 40 years of experience with similar equipment and understood details the manuals did not. He presented the idea respectfully to Torin. Torin listened and said it was an interesting observation that he would pass along to technical specialists. 2 weeks later, the change was implemented, almost exactly as Bran had suggested. When the improvement was announced, the credit went to a young Earth caste engineer who had apparently devised the innovation after consultation with human laborers. Bran said nothing. None of us did. We all understood the rules. Humans could contribute. Recognition belonged elsewhere. Education followed the same pattern. Young Tau received broad and sophisticated training from childhood onward. Human children on conquered worlds received literacy, basic mathematics and technical preparation suited to likely occupations. Advanced education was rare and mostly reserved for those who showed unusual ability or usefulness. I met some of those exceptional young humans at a community gathering. They were usually in their late teens or early 20s, born under Tau rule or brought into it so young they barely remembered anything else. They spoke the Tau language fluently and understood Tau customs in ways my generation never truly could. One of them, a diplomat trainee named Kellen, told me my generation was transitional, not in a cruel way, in a patronizingly gentle way. You knew the Imperium, he said, so you will never fully accept the greater good. But my children will know only this. For them, it will simply be the way the world is. He meant it as reassurance. All I heard was loss. They would grow up thinking second place was natural, never knowing humanity had once ruled worlds on its own terms, however brutal those terms had been. Medicine revealed the hierarchy too. And not only medicine. Status was visible in hundreds of tiny, ordinary ways once I learned to watch for it. Tau housing was larger, better placed, and more elegantly furnished. Tau civic spaces were quieter, less crowded, and better maintained. Tau schedules bent around Tau convenience. Human schedules bent around whatever remained. None of this was done with overt contempt. That was almost the strangest part. The inequality did not come with insults. It came with an assumption, so deeply embedded it no longer needed to announce itself. In mixed meetings, the Tau stood at the center, and humans arranged themselves around them without being told. In shared cafeterias, the Tau occupied the tables nearest the serving stations, while human groups drifted naturally to the periphery. Even conversation followed rank. If a Tau interrupted a human, the human stopped. If a human interrupted a Tau, the room stiffened. All of us performed the hierarchy because all of us understood it, whether or not we admitted it. Medicine revealed the hierarchy too. When Leora was injured in a production accident and a heavy component crushed her right leg, Tau medics responded quickly. They stabilized her, saved her from shock, and repaired much of the damage. But when it came time for prosthetics, the limits became clear. A Tau with a similar injury would have received a sophisticated biomechanical limb nearly indistinguishable from the original. Leora received a functional mechanical prosthesis, strong enough to walk and work, but visibly artificial and limited in motion. Resources must be distributed according to contribution and need, a human administrator explained when workers asked about the disparity. Tau citizens require optimal functionality for their more complex roles. Humans receive appropriate support for theirs. It sounded reasonable on the surface. Beneath it was the old truth in new language. Our worth was measured by utility, and by definition our utility was considered lower. Social life reflected the same structure. Friendships did form between humans and Tau, but even the warmest of them carried an invisible hierarchy. Tau mentored, humans learned. Tau guided, humans were guided. Romantic relationships were rarer still. Officially, such things were personal matters, neither forbidden nor encouraged. In practice, they were almost non-existent, partly because of biological differences, partly because of culture, but mostly because the idea of a Tau and a human as true social equals was nearly unthinkable. Food was another quiet marker of status. Tau had their own cuisine, suited to their biology and taste. Humans were fed well, better than most Imperial citizens ever were, but it was adapted food, simplified dishes and reconstructed human recipes made from what was available. Shared gatherings were possible, but even then the separation remained. Tau tended to occupy the center of social space. Humans hovered at the edges, included but never fully inside. Language reinforced it all. Many Tau spoke Low Gothic well enough to direct labor or negotiate policy, but fluency was rarely reciprocal. Some human administrators learned Tau well enough to mediate, but most of us received only practical phrases, work terms, civic formulas, and the vocabulary needed to show obedience. The deeper a discussion became, the more likely it was to slip beyond us into Tau speech. Nuance lived there. Policy lived there. Final authority lived there. Translation could carry meaning across, but translation is never power itself. That fact weighed on me more than I expected. Under the Imperium, language had also been a weapon, but at least it was our weapon. Now even the grammar of public life reminded us we were living inside another civilization and being permitted only partial access to its mind. Language reinforced it all. Tau learned enough Low Gothic to give orders, make announcements, and negotiate. Only a few humans ever gained deep fluency in Tau. Important decisions still happened in a language most of us barely understood. We relied on human administrators to translate the will of our rulers back to us. Those administrators formed their own curious class. Not Tau, yet clearly elevated above ordinary humans. Some were sincere believers like Corvin, who spoke about the greater good with genuine conviction and seemed honestly invested in helping people adapt. Others were opportunists, the sort who would thrive under any power structure so long as they could stand near the top of it. They wore better fabrics, had access to better information, moved through Tau facilities with a confidence ordinary workers lacked. If the rest of us were learning how to survive under a new order, they were learning how to climb inside it. I came to understand that these intermediaries were essential to Tau rule. The Tau could promise patience and rationality from above, but it was human mouths that translated those promises into the everyday language of compliance. When a worker complained, it was usually a human administrator who explained why reassignment was necessary. When morale dipped, it was usually a human believer who spoke about the generosity of the greater good. Power felt less alien when it wore a familiar face, and perhaps that made it harder to resist. One such administrator in our sector was a woman named Vesra. She wore robes styled after the water caste and spoke to reluctant workers with barely concealed contempt. People like her often felt harsher than the Tau themselves. The Tau could afford patience. Human collaborators, forever trying to prove their value, could not. One night Bran and I sat in the common area of our hab block and talked about all of this. He told me life was better now, undeniably better, but better did not mean free. It was just another cage, prettier than the last and stocked with better food. I told him maybe every system was a cage. Maybe the real question was not whether we were enclosed, but how large the cage was, how comfortable it felt, and how much light got through the bars. He gave a sharp little laugh and called that the philosophy of a slave. Lesser chains were still chains. "What is the alternative?" I asked. "Resistance," he said. "Against what?" "Better housing, enough food, medicine that means your children can grow without coughing blood by 20. "Against the fact that no one asked us," Bran replied. "Against trading one kind of servitude for another and pretending it is liberation because the new masters are polite." His words haunted me because he was right. And so was I. We were second-class citizens in Tau society, but we were living second-class citizens, healthier than we had ever been, with futures extending beyond the next shift. I still did not know whether that was a fair bargain. At night I lay in my clean bed beneath a clean ceiling, listening to efficient life support systems hum through the walls, and wondered whether I had become a slave so well fed he had forgotten what freedom meant, or whether I had simply learned that in the 41st millennium true freedom was a luxury offered to no one, human or alien, and choosing the form of unfreedom that let you live with some dignity was not betrayal. It was survival. Not everyone accepted the new order, even after months under Tau administration. Some clung fiercely to Imperial faith. Secret communities formed in hidden rooms and maintenance shafts, places where people still prayed to the Emperor away from Tau surveillance. They knew open revolt would be suicide against Tau technology, so they practiced quieter resistance, missed quotas, subtle sabotage, whispered propaganda reminding people of their Imperial heritage. I discovered one of those networks by accident about a year after the Tau takeover. I was in a communal sanitation block, one of the few places where surveillance was lighter out of respect for human privacy, and I noticed marks scratched into a stall wall. At first I thought it was random vandalism. Then I looked closer and saw the shape of the aquila, the two-headed eagle of the Emperor. Beneath it, carved into the metal in Low Gothic, were the words he protects. Faith liberates. Remember who you are. I stood staring at it while my pulse thudded in my ears. I had not prayed in months. I had almost forgotten the rhythm of Imperial hymns, but seeing that symbol reached into me anyway and pulled up guilt, nostalgia, and a strange, sharp grief. Over the next week I started noticing other signs. Tiny Imperial symbols scratched into machinery, workers wearing hidden charms under their uniforms, hushed conversations that stopped the moment anyone came near. I did not seek them out, but I did not report what I saw either. Perhaps that was its own kind of resistance. The Tau response to dissent was characteristic. No mass arrests, no public executions. Instead, they used tools far subtler and in some ways more effective. What they understood, better than the Imperium ever had, was that terror is expensive. Fear can produce obedience, but it also produces martyrs, legends, and desperate courage. Comfort breeds something else. Comfort breeds caution. Once people have enough food, enough medicine, enough room to imagine tomorrow, they become reluctant to risk losing it. The Tau did not merely rule us. They taught us to measure the cost of defiance in terms of all the small dignities we had only recently acquired. That calculation did more to pacify Meridian Prime than any massacre could have. Once people have children in functioning schools, medicine for old parents, and decent meals at regular intervals, rebellion no longer feels abstractly noble. It feels like a threat directed at the fragile island of stability you have managed to build. I do not say this proudly. I say it because it is true. The Tau understood that a person who has been given almost nothing all his life can be controlled very effectively by the promise that the little he has finally received might be taken away. Surveillance increased first. Drones began appearing in areas where they had once been uncommon. Human administrators conducted more frequent check-ins, asking workers about morale, adaptation, and ideological concerns. Those judged at risk were scheduled for additional instruction, more lessons, more contact with deeply committed human loyalists who could testify to the benefits of embracing the greater good. For open resistance, the response was harder. Leora, the woman with the mechanical leg, was eventually identified as part of a resistance cell. The arrest was quiet. Fire warriors arrived at her hab early in the cycle and escorted her away without spectacle. No public accusation. No example made before the crowd. By the next day her workstation had been reassigned and her name had vanished from the roster. 3 weeks later she returned. Physically she looked fine, maybe better rested than before. The real change was in her eyes, in her posture, in the perfect calm of her speech. "I was misled," she said at a mandatory community gathering where she was made to share her experience. "I clung to a faith that promised meaning through suffering, that told me pain made me noble. The Tao helped me understand the truth. The Emperor cannot hear us. He cannot save us. Only through the greater good can we find purpose." The words were flawless. The delivery was flawless. That was what made it horrifying. The woman who had once spoken with raw anger now sounded like a careful machine wearing her voice. The Tao called it re-education, clarification, guidance. They insisted it was not torture, not crude brainwashing. Maybe they were telling the truth in the narrowest possible sense. But when a person came back so thoroughly rewritten, when every sharp edge of who they had been was gone, it felt like a form of execution all the same. Not the killing of the body, but the killing of whatever had made that body itself. After Leora returned, the hidden prayers grew quieter. The carved aquilas disappeared. Resistance cells were not destroyed, but they burrowed deeper underground. Everyone understood the lesson. Under the Tao, the punishment for rebellion was not always death. Sometimes it was continued life as someone else. That was the genius of their method. They did not need execution stages. One rewritten dissenter was more persuasive than 100 public shootings. There was another mechanism too, softer and no less real: dependency. The longer we lived under Tao administration, the more normal the improvements became. Clean water, sufficient food, medical care, safe housing, schooling for children. These should have been basic human rights. After life in the Imperium, they felt miraculous, and miracles once granted can always be withheld. The threat was never spoken aloud. The Tao did not need to make it explicit. Everyone understood. Those who cooperated lived better. Those who resisted found their conditions gradually becoming less comfortable. Not because anyone announced punishment, but because resources were allocated according to trust, usefulness, and ideological reliability. It happened to a worker named Doran who voiced too many questions during an education session. He was not arrested. He was not sent away for rewriting. His job assignment simply changed to a harsher role in a rougher section of the complex. His hab was downsized. His educational opportunities narrowed. No one called it punishment. It was merely administrative redistribution. The message was unmistakable. Over time, Doran softened. He attended extra instruction voluntarily. His questions became less frequent. 6 months later, he had his better job back and a more comfortable room again. For those of us watching, the lesson was plain. Survival under the Tao required more than compliance of body. It required performance of belief. You did not necessarily have to believe in the greater good with your whole heart. You had to speak as though you did. You had to perform the rituals, say the phrases, show the right kind of gratitude. It became a kind of theater in which we were all actors and audience at once. I found myself participating more deeply every day. I repeated the formulas at assemblies. I nodded through education sessions. I expressed appreciation for our improved conditions. And part of me, a part I hated admitting, meant those words. Because despite every limit, despite the hierarchy, despite the careful control, my life under the Tao was better than it had been under the Imperium. I was healthier, better fed, less afraid. I had a future that reached farther than the next quota report. Was that enough? Was comfortable servitude preferable to brutal loyalty? I had no answer. I only knew that in the 41st millennium survival was the nearest thing to victory most people would ever see. The deepest transformation, though, did not begin with my generation. It began with children. Children born under Tau rule, or brought into it so young that the Imperium was little more than a vague story, were blank slates. The Tau wrote on them with methodical care. The schools they built were nothing like the education I had known. Instead of catechisms and industrial drills, children studied literacy, mathematics, science, history, and, woven through all of it, the philosophy of the greater good. The schools were clean, well-equipped, and staffed by both human teachers and Tau mentors. Curiosity was encouraged. Questions were welcomed. That alone would have seemed revolutionary to the child I had once been. I visited one of those schools as part of a community program meant to showcase Tau investment in humanity's future. The contrast with my own upbringing was almost painful. Children sat at real desks with adaptive learning tablets. Classes were small enough for individual attention. Teachers spoke to students with respect. But the content was curated with extraordinary care. History presented the Imperium as a failed project, noble perhaps in origin but corrupted by fanaticism and fear. The Emperor was taught not as a god but as a powerful and flawed man whose vision had been betrayed by his followers. The greater good was not taught as ideology so much as obvious truth, as self-evident as mathematics. Different species could cooperate. Individual worth came from contribution, not birth. Progress came from collaboration, not war. Children absorbed all of it with the effortless trust only children possess. They had no context to resist, no counter-narrative. For them the Tau were not occupiers. They were simply the government, the order of the world, the thing that had always been there. I found that more unsettling than adult conversion. Adults like me could still remember contradiction. We could compare old pain to new order and argue with ourselves about the meaning of the exchange. Children could not. They inherited the result without the memory of what had been traded away. Because of that, their gratitude was cleaner and their loyalty deeper. There is a kind of power in being loved by people who do not remember a before. I watched a classroom where a young human teacher explained the Tau caste to children 7 and 8 years old. "The fire caste protects us," she said, projecting hololithic images of fire warriors in battle armor. "They are brave and disciplined. Without them, the Tau Empire could not defend the worlds that have embraced the greater good." A little girl raised her hand and asked if humans could become fire warriors. The teacher hesitated only briefly. "Humans serve the greater good in many military roles," she said. "We are not born into the fire caste, but we can be auxiliaries. Support roles are also important for defending the empire." The child accepted that without trouble. Of course humans could not be fire warriors. Of course our role was support. That was simply how reality worked. After class, I asked the teacher whether she remembered the Imperium. "Until I was 15, she said. "Then the Tau came, the best thing that ever happened to our world." "Do you remember what it was like before them?" I asked. "Every day," she said. "Hunger, fear. My brother was taken into the Astra Militarum at 14 and vanished into some war I will never know the name of. These children will never know that fear. They will have limits, yes, and hardships, but they will also have choices. They will have futures." I could not argue with her. The children in that room had more opportunity than I had ever imagined at their age. They also carried themselves differently. Shoulders unbowed, voices unafraid of teachers, an ease in their own bodies that comes from growing up without expecting every institution to hurt you. I had to admit that this, more than any speech about ideology, was persuasive. The Tau were not merely changing what children believed. They were changing what kinds of people those children could become by stripping away some of the fear that had defined every adult I knew under the Imperium. And yet they were also becoming something not entirely human in the old sense. Not biologically, Their blood was human, their flesh was human, but culturally they were hybrids, shaped by Tao language, Tao values and Tao assumptions, belonging completely to neither civilization and perhaps to a new one altogether. I saw the proof when those children grew into workers. They arrived bright, efficient, and unfailingly polite. They switched between low Gothic and Tao speech with ease. They understood technology better than my generation ever had. But when I tried to speak to them about the old days, about what life under the Imperium had felt like, most of them met me with blank incomprehension. One trainee, named Lucan, said it most clearly. "I respect what you lived through," he told me over a meal, "but I do not understand why you hold on to it. The Imperium hurt you. The Tau offers something better. Why look backward at the system that caused your pain?" "Because it was ours," I said, struggling to explain. "Because however cruel and broken it was human. Built by humans, ruled by humans, tied to thousands of years of our history." Lucan frowned. "What does that matter if the system itself creates suffering? Is it really better to live badly under human masters than well under alien ones?" Logically, he was right. I had no clean answer. My attachment to the Imperium was irrational, emotional, tied not to comfort but to identity. The younger generation felt none of that. To them, the Imperium was just one failed empire in history, replaced by something more functional. Their pragmatism made them ideal subjects. It also meant something deeply human was disappearing without mourning because they had never possessed it in the first place. 5 years passed. 5 years in which Meridian Prime was remade so thoroughly I still struggle to understand the scale of it. I sit now in a small park built where an industrial dump once stood. There are real trees here, not huge ones, but living and green. Hydroponic systems filter and recirculate clean water through a little pond where the bottom is visible. Children play nearby, human children and a few young Tau together, switching between languages without thinking. Their friendships ignore the species division that felt absolute to my generation. For a moment, in places like this, the Tau promise feels almost real. A future where ancient hatreds fade and cooperation replaces fear. Sometimes I watch the children long enough that I can almost imagine my own suspicion as a relic, some emotional scar that will die with my generation. Perhaps that is how empires win most completely, not by crushing the old world in one dramatic gesture, but by making the next generation sincerely unable to understand why anyone mourned it. Then I noticed the fire warrior patrolling the perimeter with pulse rifle held in relaxed readiness. I notice the surveillance drones circling overhead. I notice the human administrator checking parent ident tags to make sure only approved citizens use the space. Even here in this oasis of engineered calm, control is present, polite, subtle, unceasing. I think about the road that brought me here: factory worker, collaborator, citizen, subject, traitor. Each label feels both true and false. I am not the same man I was under the Imperium. That man was killed not by the Tau, but by seeing how life could exist without the permanent cruelty I had mistaken for inevitability. And yet, I am not what the Tau want me to become either. I say the right things, perform the right gestures, show the right enthusiasm, but some part of me remains watchful, skeptical, anchored to memories that predate the greater good. Perhaps that is the fate of my generation. We are transition people, caught between worlds, fully belonging to neither. We remember the Imperium too clearly to surrender without residue, but we have lived under the Tau too long to keep pretending the Imperium was the highest form of human civilization. Sometimes I wonder what would happen if the Imperium returned tomorrow. The correct answer should be simple. I am human. I should rejoice at liberation from alien rule. I should welcome the armies of mankind. When I am honest, I know the truth. I would be afraid. I know what imperial liberation looks like. I have seen enough propaganda and heard enough stories to understand that our entire world would be declared tainted. Every citizen would become a suspect. All Tau-built improvements would be dismantled or destroyed. Those who openly collaborated, administrators, teachers, believers like Mareth, would face public execution as examples. And I, even as nothing more than a laborer who did what was necessary to survive, would still be guilty. I spoke the words of the greater good. I attended Tau instruction. I lived in Tau housing and ate Tau food. By Imperial standards, that would be enough. At best, I might be thrown into a penal legion and sent to die in some hellish war zone to atone for the crime of surviving under Zeno's rule. At worst, mind-wiping, servitor conversion, or a bullet to the back of the skull. What horrifies me most about that thought is not death. After the life I had before, death has never seemed especially distant. What horrifies me is that Imperial return would erase everything built here. I know too well how the Imperium deals with contamination. There would be interrogations, purity sweeps, confessions extracted in the name of salvation. Every improvement introduced by Tau hands would be examined as corruption rather than aid. Every citizen would be forced to prove loyalty to a state that had abandoned us long before the first alien ship entered orbit. It would call that abandonment noble necessity. Then it would demand gratitude from the survivors. Perhaps that is the deepest heresy inside me now. Not that I no longer love humanity, but that I no longer trust the Imperium to represent it. 5 years of slow improvement. 5 years of learning that life might contain more than endurance. All those small moments of possibility would be burned away by the same regime that claims to defend humanity. But the Imperium never came. For 5 years there was no liberation fleet, no space marines descending from the heavens to save us from alien oppression. Maybe the war elsewhere mattered more. Maybe Meridian Prime was too insignificant to justify the resources required to reclaim it. Maybe the Imperium's borders had simply stretched past the point where losing one more hive world even registered. Whatever the reason, the result was the same. We were alone with our new rulers, left to find our own ways to survive in a system we had not chosen. I think often of Bran, the old worker who spoke about cages and freedom. He died 3 months ago. Not from cruelty, not from a work accident. He died in his bed in a comfortable hab with medical staff present to make his last hours painless. He was 72 years old, an age almost no one from the lower hive reached. In his final days, I visited him. His mind was still clear, though his body was failing. Do you know the funniest thing he told me? I lived better under the Tau for 5 years than I lived under the Emperor for 67. I ate better, slept better, hurt less, but I still cannot decide whether accepting it was right. Accepting what I asked. This, he said, my grandfather fought orcs on Armageddon, died holding a line so civilians could escape. He would never have bowed to Xenos, never made peace with them. But you are not him, I said. No, he answered. I am not. I am just an old fool who wanted to live long enough to know what it feels like not to wake in agony every morning. An old fool who wanted to die in a bed instead of under a machine or choking on poison. He looked at me for a long moment. Does that make me a traitor? I thought about all the answers doctrine would allow and discarded them. It makes you human, I said at last. Just human. A man trying to spend the little time he has with less pain than the universe would otherwise demand. Bran smiled and said maybe we were both just rationalizing, telling ourselves pretty stories so we could sleep at night in the comfortable beds our alien masters provided. He died the next day. There was a ceremony for him, small and quiet, a blend of human custom and Tau formality. A few words about his contribution to the greater good, acknowledgement of his years of labor. His body was cremated and the ashes given to a niece I had never met. It was more dignity than the Imperium would have offered him. It was also not the old rites, not the prayers to the Emperor and the promise of reunion in his light. Several of us stood there afterward in silence, because none of us quite knew what emotions we were permitted to feel. Gratitude that he had died gently. Grief that he had to become a collaborator to receive such gentleness. Resentment that such basic mercy had ever been extraordinary enough to provoke gratitude at all. Bran would have laughed at that confusion. He would have called it proof that we were still trapped between languages, between moral systems, between loyalties. Perhaps he would have been right. Now I sit in the park, while the false sun of the lighting panels dims to imitate evening. Children are called home by human parents and Tau guardians alike. A fire warrior completes his patrol. The drones continue their endless orbit above. Soon I will return to my hab. Tomorrow there will be another work cycle. I still have quotas. I still have duties. But the work will not kill me the way it killed my parents. I will work 8 hours, not 12 or 18. I will eat decent food. I will sleep in a bed meant for rest. This is not freedom. It is not self-determination. It is not some triumphant victory of human will over alien domination. But it is life, real life, not merely a slow death stretched across decades. And maybe in the 41st millennium, in a galaxy where humanity is besieged from every side, and the very idea of progress has been buried beneath endless war, maybe that counts as happiness. Maybe this is only the story of ordinary people forced into impossible choices, trying to carve out dignity and meaning inside circumstances they did not create and cannot control. We live under Tau occupation. In the eyes of the Imperium, we collaborate with Xeno's authorities and have betrayed the species we once served. We are traitors, apostates, cowards. But we are also alive. We look toward futures that extend beyond the next factory shift. We carry a careful, cautious hope that life can improve instead of only worsening. Whether that hope is betrayal of humanity or simply its adaptation, I still do not know. After 5 years under the Tau, I still do not know. All I know is that tomorrow I will wake, go to work, speak the proper words and make the proper gestures. I will live one more day in this strange reality where the greater good has replaced the emperor as the principle around which public life turns. Maybe 100 years from now, maybe 1,000, historians will look back on this period and judge us for what we did, for what we accepted, for the compromises we made. But they will judge from their own distance, through their own circumstances and moral frameworks. They will not stand where I stand now, in the twilight of a transformed world, caught between memory of suffering and the reality of improvement. They will not know what it feels like to be an ordinary human living under Tau rule. I know. This is my story. No heroism, no excuses, only survival in a galaxy that offers no clean answers, only impossible choices and the endless, exhausting need to keep living anyway.